Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And this is our weekly look at things having to do with the environment. Today is the 20th of November, 2016. We have hit a cold snap. I can easily be your weather forecaster and report, because I bicycle and do all these shows. It is cold out there. I thought I could make do with my fingerless gloves that you normally use for bicycling, and guess what? I'm going to have to put on real gloves from now on if it's like this. So, and yeah, anything having to do with the environment and everything else that Dave is
still wearing sandals?
No, actually, thank you very much for asking. I did have the common sense when I realized the temperature this morning was 28 degrees to put on shoes and socks. So yes, it is cold enough to not wear your Birkenstocks out of doors.
Okay, well, last week we dealt with master naturalists and stewards and places where people could go. I had been thinking to say something about politics and the Trump era, but I think so much has been said about that, we don't need to say anything much ourselves. I think what I want to say is that a lot of what we can do is to work with wee folk, little folk, and also wee folk, bigger folk, to do small things that we talk to each other and actually do things. So there's a couple of small things here that might be along those lines. I've got a nice little card from a 4-H group that we had at Camp Creek. So just something that inspires young people, and we need young people in the future. I have here a bunch of lightweight aluminum. It's called dirty aluminum because most people throw it into the dumpster or into their garbage can without regard to cleaning it up. So it's well known as dirty aluminum. Comes in different sizes. They're surprisingly expensive, but they're sort of thin weight aluminum, so there's not an awful lot of, I probably have in hand half a pound of aluminum, and if you're lucky you get a few cents a pound, but many of the salvage places won't take it because it is dirty. Just cleaning things up a little bit is helpful. Just cleaning up your plastic so it is acceptable for salvage is just a small task, but it all adds up. I went to the farmer's market, so I talk to people at the farmer's market and find out what they're doing. So the first person I walked into was a wool person, and so I have grown up with sheep in Australia, so that took me back to Australia, and the mention was of merinos and Corriedales, and these are breeds of sheep that I know well. The Australians, when they were settling Australia, when convicts could no longer come to the US and went to Australia, one of the attempts was to take merino sheep from Spain, and whether it was on the first fleet or other fleets, I'm not sure, but Spain had developed a merino sheep that was very wool producing. It was developed from a wild sheep that also could be harvested for wool. That doesn't mean killing the plant, the animal. That means shearing the animal. And so merino sheep were taken to Australia, and then there was a subsequent a lot of breeding. One of the things that Australians thought would be interesting to do would be to increase the amount of surface area by having wrinkled-bodied sheep. So you had these sheep with a corrugated surface layer. But that didn't work out because Australia is in a warmer climate, and you're likely to get flies that strike in the grooves. So you get various chemicals that ooze out of the body that accumulate in that groove, and that's where the flies can sometimes strike. So the research showed that there should be a very plain-bodied sheep, and that not only that, they make sure that it has a tight fleece, because they, at the rear where you have a tail and feces, and if you have wrinkled material in that area, you're likely to have flies below that area. So part of grazing sheep is to remove a little bit of that skin at that level and let the rump area tighten up so it's all clean and the feces doesn't stick to it and it doesn't get blown. Let's go back to seeing what you could do with sheep in Australia. You refer to ranches here. The Australians refer to their sheep property as stations. There's usually a station homestead. It depends where you are, but if you're dealing with production of meat, mutton, you might have a different yard than a shearing shed, but most graziers would have a shearing shed. It's rather large. It's up on pedestals or foundations that allow sheep to be stored underneath it, so that if you have a shearing happening, then the sheep can be stored under there before they're shorn, and perhaps after they're shorn, because if they get caught in a cold period like we were having now, without their fleece, they could be in danger. So you don't want that what fleece they have left getting wet. Well, sheep in Australia are confined to the areas west of the Great Divide. We've talked before about plate tectonics and having a range of mountains that are not awfully high along the east coast of Australia with a modest coastal plain. Well, that coastal plain is relatively humid. Those mountains catch water, the clouds rise up, and then moisture falls. Where I grew up, we could quite easily have 80 inches of rain a year. often distributed mainly in January, or more or less a monsoon, tail end of a monsoon, the south end of a monsoon. So sheep don't do very well on the coast because they have various parasites, and one of them is liver fluke, which has part of its life cycle in water, and this is hard. There are foot and mouth diseases. There is there are other parasites, including worms. So the sheep go up over the mountains and on the slopes to the west. As you go west, you get drier. On the immediate slopes, the land is reasonably fertile, nothing like what you have in east central Illinois, but it can grow grasses, and you can have what is called cockying. Cockying is when you actually dig the soil and put in a crop that's perhaps a legume or a crop for hay, but it can also be pastured, and you would have improved pastures with clovers in, and you would have tractors that can handle rough terrain, and that area is usually occupied by fat lambs. There's enough pasture to raise a lamb, probably not as quickly as you do here, but you can sell that fat lamb for the meat industry. A little further west, as it gets drier, you're more likely to get merinos and associate breeds of sheep. At the merino end, you have wool that is very fine. You judge it by the number of crimps per inch, and it's a very high price for a lot of crimps per inch. On the other end of the spectrum is a Lincoln that has a very few crimps to the inch, and the Lincoln is more a sheep for fiber, but also for meat. In between, there's a bunch of sheep: Cardell's, Romney, Marsh, Border Leicester, Suffolk. They're all dual-purpose sheep. They can be used for meat, and they can also be shorn for fiber. The fiber won't be as good as the merino fiber, but they can exist where there is a rough terrain, and they are often bred with merinos. So you have a merino Cardell cross or something like that. The Suffolk is a smaller sheep that is also a very good meat sheep. If you are a wool person that uses wool, you will look for those sorts of fibers that you like to use. The merino sheep has had a lot of research. They know how many fibers there are on each inch of skin, and they do a lot to eliminate what is called Kemp fibers. Kemp fibers are more or less like hair, and your wool is graded down if you have Kemp fibers. So the more refined merino sheep don't have that sort of fiber. But then if you are a hobbyist or a person dealing with spinning and weaving, then you might enjoy that fiber. So that's when something like a Lincoln's wool comes in handy, because it's long and you can have a swatch of it, and it can be infused into sweaters or whatever you're doing, artwork. And so you can collect wool in Australia. My brother lives on the slopes near Orange, west of Sydney, over the mountains, and when I've been asked to collect fabric for craft purposes, then I've gone around and the farmers can tell you that this is a Corriedale Merino cross, or this is a Lincoln, or what have you. And some of them are a different color, and some of them have a different strength. When you go further west, you're going to get sheep basically for fabric, for fiber, and the pastures are not so prone to allow for the fat lamb industry or the mutton industry. You have to also understand that there are various stages of the sheep's life. It can be a lamb, it can be a hogget, which might be about 2 years old. Then you have a mutton sheep, and then by the time you got to the age of about 5, the sheep is getting older and is often known as a cracker. So you're working with a field that is often very open. So if you're in the plains of Australia, you have a ranch-style house called a station. There'd be a manager and the manager's wife and family and several workers who almost become part of the family. You have a wooden stove, a combustion stove probably, and you get used to feeding a large family. Nearby there will be horse stables, but there will also be a shearing shed with yards. The sheep will be out in the range, and if you've organized for shearing, then you have a group of shearing sheds that are the apartments for itinerant shearers. So they'll come, and a good shearer might do 300 sheep a day, but there'll be a team, and there'll be some people who are crack shearers, and some that are maybe local yokels that are joining the crowd for a while, and they might not be quite as used to doing that. It's a very tough game. In that shearing shed there is a board, and that board has probably 6 or 7 shearing stands on it. The sheep are brought in with the aid of sheepdogs. Australians would be lost without their sheepdogs. These are not lassie-type dogs. They probably have some lassie in them, but if you have a lassie out in some of the Australian burly areas, they're going to come in with a lot of burrs, and the sheep are going to have burrs. So that's not so wonderful. So most Australian sheepdogs are tight in their fur, but they're very intelligent, and they can herd sheep and keep them into a circle, and if one gets away, the dog will actually run across the top of the sheep in order to stop the wayward sheep from getting out of the circle. They're brought in, put in yards, and some of them are put under the shearing shed just in case it might rain. Those sheep are then brought in. There's usually a person on the board that organizes bringing in the sheep. You know how to grab a sheep and turn it up so that you can deliver it to the shearer sitting on its backside. There's also a tar buoy just in case the shearer nicks a little piece of skin, and immediately you put tar on it to stop it from bleeding. There's an organisation that goes with that board. There's also someone who's experienced at picking up the fleece, and there's a rough person, a person who has a rough task of taking off the fleece the bad parts, and then it goes to a wool classer, and he's going to class that fleece. Well, the animal is brought in. The floors are usually nice and greasy and made of usually tallow wood or something that is a very close grain, and the sheep can be slid around without a lot of bother. There's a way to start to work with taking off a sheep's fleece. You have a stroke that comes up the belly, and then you go round in circles until you release that area, and you go to the shoulders and the tail, and eventually take the back. The fleece will fall on the ground in a certain way, and you will fold it up so that the pizzle areas and the birdie areas are on top, so that someone who is removing that wool will have easy access to it. It also should have the shoulder wool out so that the classer can judge it. You take that fleece and you lift it up like a bed sheet, and you drop it on a frame that is it has some sort of way of items falling through it if necessary, so it usually has a bunch of poles or metal bars that allow that to happen. The fleece is dropped down so that the classer can class that fleece. Then the fleece is rolled professionally, so you know, or auctioneers can allow you to check sample fleeces and know what they're looking at. The fleece then goes to a baler, and the fleeces are baled down into heavy bales that are eventually transported to places like Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide or Brisbane, and they're put to auction. Australia has tended to live on the sheep's back, but that came to a sudden conclusion when plastics came in and wool was not as popular. One of the problems with wool is it gets insects into it, and if you've got a wool sweater and you don't care for it, you might just have insects into it and you'll come up with holes. Plastic fabrics don't do that, and so there was a move away from wool. Wool is very warm. It has air spaces in it that make it warm and gentle, And so it's not totally out of being the major income for Australia, but it does have its challenges.
Can you tell us approximately when it was that wool started to lose its favor? I'm picturing plastics as more of a 1950-ish sort of thing.
Yes,
Okay.
50s and 60s.
Okay.
That's a good question. So, bringing wool to town was a tough thing because some of the Australian soils, especially in the northwest of New South Wales, are very greasy, and if you have to have 10 horses pulling a huge wagon of bales of wool, you can very easily get caught. And so there's an art thing in Australia where often artists will interpret the Clydesdale or the Percheron horses working hard to draw trailers of wool through muddy environments. So eventually you get it to railheads and then to Sydney or to the major capitals where it will be sold. And the shearer's job is to give the product to the person who judges it, and then the bale is labeled so that people can get an idea of what's in there in the first place. Is this merino fine wool sheep, or is it Corriedale merino mix? And I assume that some of those bales are opened. If you have a lot of 100 bales, then some of them will be opened for inspection. So sheep in Australia is a major thing. Let me tell you about some of the operations other than shearing. First thing is to have research people who belong to the departments of agriculture, the universities that look at those sheep. For instance, the whole wrinkle-bodied era needed research to sort out sheep that would have a more refined body shape. There are also researchers that know a lot about the fibers that are produced on the sheep's back, and there's a whole genetic thing there that breeds sheep, and there are probably about 6 or 8 stations that are breeding very select sheep. You might have a ram that will sell for $3,000, and that ram is working with a flock of ewes that are also very sophisticated sheep. Once that sort of breeding territory is understood, then there is an increase, and flying flocks are bred, and often they go to other sites, so that the individual farmer doesn't always produce his own sheep. That's sometimes the case with fat lambs, for instance. But you can breed your own sheep, and you have a ram that you bought that might be expensive, and you know your flock, and you know what you're going to breed. Sometimes there's a move to have 2 lambs rather than twins, rather than 1 lamb. And at lambing time, you have to be around to make sure that the ewe is doing okay, and sometimes the ewe might have difficulties and pass, and that leaves lamb, and often those lambs are brought into the homestead too, and they become pets for quite a while. The sheep have to be pastured, and if you're on the slopes where there's a little more rainfall, you're likely to be cockying. That means that you can actually grow a pasture with clovers in it. That's called cockying, whereas further west you don't tend to do so much cockying. Sometimes it's a matter of flying the pastures with a plane and sowing from the air, because you couldn't get a tractor up on the hills where the sheep can go. You sometimes put in fertilizer, especially superphosphate, because Australians have soils that have been under the ocean and somewhat leached, and they're deficient in sulfur and phosphate. So sulfur phosphate is often a fertilizer that's flown in by plane, and the pilots of those small planes are daredevils, and they're appreciated because they can fly around trees or under wires, like telephone wires and things like that, and do their job effectively. So you have some improved pastures. Further west, the sheep are allowed to have more area per sheep, and not quite so much pasture improvement. There'll be some, but working with native grasses. Native grasses are not unlike here, where native grasses don't come in early in the season, so you may want some areas that are improved pastures, so the sheep get a good pick in the spring. As the season goes on, you're going to have to do battle with parasites, and these, one of the main ones is a liver fluke, which gets into the liver of the sheep, and this is partially why the sheep are not kept on the coastal plains. The liver fluke has one of its stages in a snail in the water, and so when it gets drier, you have less problem with liver fluke. You also have worms, and so there is an area where you have a ditch, and it's for wetting down sheep with an herbicide, or not an herbicide, an insecticide, and it's called a sheep dip. Sheep are funny creatures, so you take one sheep and tie it up in the advance end, and then all the other sheep will follow through. You have a forky stick which pushes the sheep down under the water, and that is quite effective. At the same time, more modern is to have a spraying tank where the sheep is put into the tank, several of them at a time, like a 1,000-gallon tank, and they're sprayed. At the same time, Australian leached soils often are deficient in micronutrients like molybdenum, so you have a little steel plug that it's like a pill that you put down the sheep's throat, and it has in it molybdenum, iron, zinc, copper, in the amounts that would make it suitable for nutrition. Some of those ingredients are poisonous, especially copper, if you have too much. So the right amount is good. But if you take sheep from an area that has sufficient micronutrients, and you take it to a place like a beach where the soil is even more leached, then after a while you'll find that the sheep's fiber breaks, and you can take a whole fleece and lift it off the sheep in the field. So it's very necessary to have that procedure. You're also still faced with flies. And flies get into the areas behind and around the anus, and so there is a crutching. That's where you take some shears and you can take a small piece out of each side of the thigh to allow that skin to tighten and be very difficult for a fly to blow. At the same time, you dock off the tail, which is about a foot long, and you also castrate the male animals that you're going to sell. That's quite a task. Somebody has to hold the sheep up, and surprisingly, it's a very bloody task. But people who do this often do it with their own teeth. They take the testicles out. Someone who has good teeth can take the testicles out. They spit them out, and the male sheep goes off and can be used for wool or for meat. It's probably even more important for meat than it is for wool. But you don't want a whole half flock of male sheep. So that's a period when sheep is going through its growth, and you will have to be out there some to check. When you do have a ram, you want to know what ram has serviced a sheep. So there's a chalk which you put on the underbelly of the ram, so that when it mounts on the ewe, it leaves an indication of who serviced that ewe. So lambing is in there. Then there's the crutching season. Then there's shearing. The shearers are itinerant. They are going to be working their way up the slopes and plains of Australia, often as a group, and they expect to have good accommodation and good food. I was castigated at some stage because I'd selected a sheep that wasn't quite as fat as the shearers thought it should be. You have to feel along the back of the sheep, its thighs and its tail, and get a suitable mutton for the shearers. And they work fast. Often the rouseabouts are local people or the farmers' sons or employees, and sometimes a game local will join the shearers, the crew. There have been attempts to industrialize this shearing when shearers went on strike or something like that, but it's never been as effective as a shearer shearing the full fleece. The animals, when they are relieved of their fleece, just feel very excited. So when you release them out of the shearing shed, they go down a chute and they jump. Sometimes they'll jump 6 feet, and they're rather excited. But you also have to make sure that you put them on a paddock that is not cold, and there's got some trees or things to protect them from the cold. But they enjoy being sheared. Horses are very helpful if you have a pony that knows how to herd sheep, and it's tremendous. And you have to watch if you're riding that the pony just doesn't take off at a right angle and leave you behind. But it's not really the fault of the pony, it's the fault of the rider that wasn't expecting what the pony was going to do, and good riders don't ever get to fall off. If you take too long to open the gate, then the pony's gone, and you're hanging on to the gate. So you're very short, work with ponies and dogs, and you get to know their personalities. So I thought I'd say something about that. And so when you go to the farmer's market, talk to people and find out what their background is. Who has sheep locally? One of the things that happens is that local people often have alpacas or llamas. Actually, in Australia, the alpacas have replaced the sheep in some sense. They're both Latin American creatures, and the alpaca is more useful for its fibers. The llama has been a beast of burden, and they have different personalities, and you might need to know how to get along with a llama, or you might, it's a little bit like getting along with donkeys. They can be kind of mean at some stages if they think they can express themselves and get away with it. So sheep are not quite so strong in character. They more or less follow like sheep, and but you can have friendly associations with your sheep if you have a small farm. But if you have 10,000 sheep, you're not going to get to know them. Just let me look at my notes here.
And I'll pop in really briefly here. It's 12:45. You're tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. And this, as you'll hear every Sunday morning at this time, is the Prairie Monk, where Dave, I always seem to start by saying that we'll be talking about the economy or ecology, and it's sheep and kangaroos and Lord knows what all. But it's okay. None of it, we don't have a lot of that around here. So yes, we're learning something.
Oh, you'd be surprised that we do have farmers here. That's one of the things we need to look at. Farming has tended to look at the reward, the financial reward. But there's a tremendous reward for doing other things with other species. Later I'll talk a little bit about vegetable gardening and what varieties of things you might use, and whether vegetable gardening is going to make you a profit as much as if you have corn and soybeans. The next person that I talked to was working with horseshoes. Well, it's an era of racehorses probably have horseshoes, but it's a past era. When I first came here, there were still people who had horses, and they were friends of the family, and they were going to be used and were used, but they have no chance of competing with a half house-sized tractor and harvest equipment and planting equipment. It's modern day John Deere or whatever, Caterpillar or whatever. So I grew up with a blacksmith, and the blacksmith was Edgar Jordan. He was as deaf as a post, because when you hit an anvil with a hammer, it makes a huge ring and it has an effect on your ears. So blacksmiths have the problem of having poor hearing. He had a big forge and probably an 8-foot bellows with a big handle, and you pulled it down. If you wanted just a gentle breeze of air on your coals, then you just did it very slowly. If you wanted your steel to be not only orange and red, then you wanted it blue like an axe head, you gave it more air and more heat, and so then you might want to take tongs and put the advanced edge of that axe into oil to give it an annealment, a hardening, case hardening it's called. But if you were doing a horseshoe, you have to shape the shoe to the horse. Is this a draft horse with perhaps a 5 or 6 inch hoof, or a riding horse or pony? Not all horses need to be shoed, but if you're going to have a pony on gravelly soil, you need to shoe it. And so what you have is more or less your fingernail, and it becomes a hoof. And it's kind of dead territory, and you're going to file the hoof flat. You've got to avoid the frog, which is the middle part of the hoof, and you file it flat, and you design the shoe to go in there. It's a steel shoe. It's about 1/8 of an inch or more thick. I talked to the gentleman who was doing artwork with shoes, and I said, "Where do you get the shoes?" "Oh," I said, he gets some from antique stores. They're awkward to work with because some shoes will be different size, so you can't have a bilaterally symmetrical piece of art. But otherwise, there's a company in Lexington, Illinois, that stamps shoes in different sizes. So if you have a shoe size, then the horse has a shoe size too. And it's done flat, so he buys the flat ones before there's a groove put in them. So then the blacksmith puts a groove in there and heats it up with very high temperature, and that groove helps to settle into the fingernail or the hoof. You have a rasp, and you rasp the shoe flat. You attend to it. Sometimes if it's got a piece of disease, you almost have to be a veterinarian to know that you have to take a knife and take out that bruised part or whatever it is. And you have to make sure that your horse is fairly kind to you, because you have to put the horse's hoof between your legs and then take that hot shoe and more or less burn it into the hoof, and then you have to nail it on. And that's why the groove is there, so the nails won't stick out. And then, but that same furrier will be F-A-R-I, not a furrier that has furs, it's a farrier. And then you have other tasks. You're going to sharpen people's plowshares, and that's going to need some of that case hardening. You have that two of the main tasks of people up to about the World War II. After that, then tractors came in. You first of all had steam tractors, and then you had regular tractors, and they would have started to come in with World War I. So the farriers these days are very specialised people, and they're very few and far between. So Edgar Jordan, we used to want to talk to Edgar, you had to shout. Lived in a little shack that was put together by himself, and of slab timber, and so I enjoyed doing it. Now I go up the road to people who are doing produce, and I've got a few minutes to say. I'm very interested in the biodiversity of produce. It's not easy to grow everything on fairly damp, fairly sticky, fairly fertile Drummer and Flanagan soils. People who grow crops often are in places like the west coast of Lake Michigan, or the east of Lake Michigan, on the west side of Michigan, where there's gravelly soil that came with glaciation and sandier soils, and they allow root crops especially to expand, and they are warm in the spring and can grow early. Here, some of the produce people I was talking to are on Yankee Ridge, which Yankee Ridge is a moraine and it has glacial till, so it has some of the influence of graveliness or sandiness, and that can grow crops fairly easily. It's changing the world, and that's what I want to say, that if you do things as a group, the wee folk, little folk, can actually change things. And it's interesting to walk into a supermarket these days and see a huge battery of vegetables and fruit that wasn't necessarily there before. And they're beginning to realize that if you're going to get canned food that is high in salt and sugar and fat, all of which sells the product, but it's not very good for your health. So as we learn a little bit more on the internet, and as we become a little bit more sophisticated as users of these materials, then you hope that some of the other plants might be adapted for heavier soils. Can we grow manioc or other plants that are in a different climate? Perhaps not, because climate has a lot to do with what you can do with vegetables. Rainfall at the right time of the year. You see it with corn and soybeans, but we'd like to see it with other plants, and I think people are enjoying that. So wander around your farmers market and chat with people and find out what they're doing. There was a wonderful talk on National Public Radio last night, and it involved an organization called Patagonia. And Patagonia is basically run by a rather excited gentleman who went to Patagonia in Latin America and decided that there wasn't very good apparel for people who were going into the cold. So he had a very exciting industry that improved by about 50% very regular intervals till he was a worldwide provider of these materials. But then he had to think about what he was doing was money, main thing. He was a person who enjoyed climbing, and he enjoyed things, and he had a team of people that wanted to look at their society. How do you organize this entrepreneurial thing. Are we going to have a king or a queen or a entrepreneur or a leader? And now we're going to say what he or she wants us to do? Or do we get together and do our own dreaming? So he started, and I think he had surrounded by his own crew of people who could do that sort of thinking. And so he's written a book which is named Let My People Surf. That means that they could go and do their own thing. And so we have to think about that sometimes. Do we operate like a beehive or an ant's nest where everyone is about equal? And how do we manage that? We may have to have some vocal person who is able to speak, but that person might not necessarily be the one that is a sole leader. If very clever, that person brings together all the other people and they allow them to do their own things, and that has spread around the world and generates enough income that they can have projects that have the same sort of thinking. And let me see if I have the name here of that gentleman. Oh, I didn't put his name in here. Okay. It's even.
I'm sure if you go online and look up Patagonia, that should probably bring the guy's name. Of course, you'll find out about the Central American or Latin American country too, but you'll also find out about this guy and his project.
So we encourage you to go do just little things, even just to remind you to wash your aluminum, and you don't get much money for it, but that much aluminum that doesn't go to the landfill is really helpful.
And of course you can reuse it. I use those actually when I do my cooking out. It provides extra moisture to the food that I'm making when you put a top over the whole thing. And those will go on and on and on and on, even though they are just thin disposable aluminum. So keep using those things.
Functional, reusable if you don't bend them up.
Exactly. Put your hand underneath them. It even says in the pan. There's the water is heavy enough that if you've got one of those that's fairly deep, you need to put your hand under it, or it could easily bend to the bottom of the pan. There you go. Cooking tips yet on this program.
So I think that's probably enough to remind you that even if you have a Trump era where you're very uncertain about what is going to happen and what's going to happen to land, and the Sierra Club is kind of upset with what might happen, and Theodore Roosevelt is there in the background. You have to think of preserving territories. Some of the things that these erstwhile different entrepreneurs do is they go to Patagonia and buy land so that it can be put into reserve. So we need the gene pool and the reserve. So this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.